Okay, we are live. Count to 5 and then go ahead and talk. Okay, we are live. Hi, Michael.
Hi, how are you? I wasn't sure if I was supposed to start talking or if Brent. So I'm glad someone broke the silence. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. I was prepared. I was so ready, like half an hour ahead of plan. But then when the machine sits in idle, it just forgets what it's doing. I had to
No
restart
problem.
over again.
No problem. It's my first time on a Twitter space, so I was just super excited that I managed to get it right on my first shot. I'm like, all right, cool. This is neat.
So this is Disability Hour, sponsored by Social Chats South Florida, which is Tanya's internet radio channel. And I'm very thrilled that Tanya has stepped on board to sponsor my Twitter Spaces shows, and always appreciate having her as my co-host. And she's built a website for me, and not only a website, made a playlist for me on her YouTube channel, and she co-hosts for me and streams the spaces out.
Excellent.
And we also blog. We also create an event. She also creates a blog and an event page for the space.
Wonderful.
So can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, Michael?
Okay, sure, absolutely. So my name is Michael Lifshitz. I am a person with a disability, originally from Montreal, living here in Ottawa for the last since December 2013, whatever the math on that works out to. And so the reason, the story that I had come on to talk to Brent about was the lack of accessible transportation in Ottawa. So last weekend, I had gone to Toronto on a trip, came back. It was a 5 hour train ride to come back from Toronto to Ottawa, and a 7 hour wait to get an accessible taxi to come home from the train station. So, as a general thumb, you should not be able to travel between cities faster than you can within cities. So that's in a nutshell what happened.
Are there like Uber or a Lyft in your area that gives special pricing or provides any of that type of services?
So Uber and Lyft in Ottawa do not have accessible vans. So I should mention, because I realize person with disability is a very vague term. So I happen to use an electric wheelchair. So that's where it gets trickier, because they don't fold and you need an accessible van with a ramp that comes out. And so in Ottawa, the city had made a deal with Uber and Lyft that they could operate without accessible vehicles, but they pay a certain fee every year to the city as an accessibility fund. So in lieu of having accessible vehicles, they put money towards the city being able to offer, be it Transpo or more accessible taxis, or somehow to improve transportation options for people with disabilities. So, like one of the big ones that have just come out is that we now have online booking. So, believe it or not, it took till 2022 for Ottawa to be able to book online. They actually started online booking 2021. So, 2021, we got online booking. Um, Toronto had it in the early 2000s, but whatever. They were quite proud that they now have an app so we can track apparently we can now track our rides online and see when they're coming. So that's a nice feature as well. So the big issue that was explained to me was that accessible taxis. Apparently, pre-COVID, we had 188 accessible taxis in Ottawa, and we're now down, I believe, to just under 100 because taxi drivers don't want to do the accessible taxis anymore. And I think part of the issue is that the what I found out was that so it's about $23,000 to adapt a van to be accessible, and the taxi drivers what they get back is a $50 rebate on their annual license fee. So if you do the math, that amounts to having to work 460 years before they recoup their investment. Which at the risk of sounding cynical, I don't think. Never mind the taxi. I don't think the cab driver's going to be around for 460 years to actually recoup that cost. So clearly, there's something that has to be done in terms of funding. Yeah.
That's kind of, there's no, see, that's but if you look at it, think about a second there. Isn't that kind of crazy to be charging someone so much money for that, and they don't give them type of like a rebate for or like getting more taxi companies, taxi drivers to incorporate this into their plan?
So
Like,
yeah. So I think the issue is that exactly the problem is politicians, and I say politicians in the global sense of the word because I think it applies to every level of government. And admittedly, I'm more familiar with our Canadian politics than American politics, but I think in general, politicians like to say we want accessibility. How we actual concrete action on how we're going to get there or how we're going to pay for that, that's kind of another story. So it's nice to say, like I know in Canada we have our accessibility, the Canadian Accessibility Act, um, and we come out with a law, and then we open up a ministry to take care of it, and we spend a bunch of money on having a ministry and like a system in place. But like my question is, would those dollars not be better used going towards actual concrete action on the ground, like helping companies become more accessible? So like Ottawa's funny in that you can tell how old a neighborhood in Ottawa is by how accessible it is. And Brent, I don't know if you've noticed, feel the same way. But what I've noticed is like the market is horrible for accessibility because it was built like I was laughing because I had gone to a bar.
I have noticed that, and
Yeah,
also I noticed that there's like accessibility challenges when they can't clear the snow properly and leave the snow in the middle of the sidewalk.
yeah, because clearing sidewalks is done for a person walking, and I would say probably a skinny person because it's a very narrow. It's kind of a narrow path. So like where I live, I don't go on the side. Unfortunately, right across from a shopping center, and I kind of cut across the street from a parking lot, from a building's parking lot to the shopping center parking lot. So usually I can get out but like on usually from like the first snowfall till spring, I don't go on the sidewalk that I live on because I'm like, it's just not like even if they've cleaned parts of it, the likelihood that I'm gonna be stuck is pretty high. And getting stuck in the winter, like there was one year that it was a particularly we got a lot of snow, and the snowbank, like I had been dropped off, so I do comedy, and I was dropped off at a club, and they dropped me off where they could find a spot to let me out, and I was wheeling back, and I'm like, the snowbanks are taller than me, and I'm like, if I get stuck in the snow, this is probably how I'm gonna die because I'll freeze to death before. Like I have a cane that, so I do get up and walk a bit. So I have a cane. So I'm like, maybe if I like raise my cane over my head, someone would see it sticking out. It is a challenge navigating in winter the sidewalks. And like making sure that the cutouts in the sidewalk are clear of snow. Because there's nothing worse than getting to the end of the sidewalk and realizing you can't get off the sidewalk. Um, Particularly when it's minus God knows what. like our Ottawa winters are not exactly warm. It's one thing in summer where it's nice out, I can wheel around. In the dead of winter, you want to move as fast as possible out of it to get back inside. So I think that's another factor that comes into play.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, what's it like being, in Ottawa, that even if it's slightly snowing, like how often would you leave your house?
So the lucky part is, like I said, I'm across from a shopping center, and that shopping center has some pretty good access to buses, so I can kind of cut across and get access to the bus. But that assumes that at the other end, I'm gonna be able, like it's more challenging because I need to know um what is waiting for me at the other end. Like, is the sidewalk at the other end when I get off the bus? Is that going to be clear of snow, and I going to be able to navigate? And then like in Ottawa, so that's why like a lot of the time I will rely more on Paris Transpo in uh in the winter months, because like in summer I have that flexibility that it's easier to navigate uh OC Transpo. So just for the benefit of it, I'm guessing, I don't know how many listeners are in Ottawa versus elsewhere, but OC Transpo is our bus service. Power Transpo is the adapted transportation that has the adapted vehicles. So, I mean, to Ottawa's credit, the buses do all have ramps. So when I first moved to Ottawa, because Montreal, our public transport system at the time was not terribly accessible. Like they were just kind of starting to get around to making it accessible. So like my first like few weeks in Ottawa, I must have looked like such a geek because I was like the little kid who's driving the bus by themselves, going to school for the first time by themselves, because it was a whole new concept for me being able to take the bus. So I'll give credit; the buses are all wheelchair accessible, but then the question becomes, when you get out of the bus, um, how easy is it for you to navigate, be it to the next bus stop or wherever it is you're going, right? Because some parts of Ottawa, for example, I work in a co-working space where the street that I would have to go down has no sidewalks. So I just kind of go in the street, which if it's not busy, it's not terrible. But and then of course the street is kind of broken with potholes. So there's a limit. You kind of have to be careful not to go over the pothole too quickly, because that's a good way to get whiplash. Um, so yeah, that's and I mean some of this I realize is the challenges of having a city. I mean sidewalks and all this stuff. I recognize that, okay, there's X amount of dollars to go around, but like everyone questions, do we have the money to do something about accessibility? And I'm like, we have the money if we use the money wisely. Uh, that would, I think, would be the key thing. Um, so I mean, I could come up with easy idea of how we would be able to afford it. And I've offered, and if any city councilors happen to listen to the show, my offer is always out there. Anyone interested? Let's sit down, have a coffee, and we can talk about it. Because like my background is business, so I understand budgets and finances and all this kinds of stuff. But
We didn't really get a chance to really read your bio. I mean,
okay,
can I just read this in this way? It gives more,
perfect.
so Michael was born with a condition called multiple congenital musculoskeletal abnormalities. In addition to wearing an artificial leg, he walks with a cane and uses a wheelchair for longer distances. Contrary to what many would believe possible, he became a chartered public accountant and obtained an MBA from Edinburgh Business School. He has built and sold successful accounting and financial planning practices. Today, in addition to continuing a successful career in finance and accounting as CFO, Michael is the co-founder of Breakaway Experiences, a gift experience company. He uses speaking, comedy, and writing to not only educate people as to what people with disabilities can do, but also to inspire them to overcome their challenges and live their life to the fullest of their abilities. So I wanted to share that because as we're talking, and I'm sitting there like, well, let's let our listeners know more about you. And because you're so humbled, you didn't go in further details of all the things you've been doing and what you've done.
And like, I'll be honest, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm proud of my accomplishments. But to me, and that's the point I try to press on people, just because I have a disability. I've gone to doctors where the doctor, like, I once had a doctor who was surprised that I was going back to class in shoes. He's like, wait, you go to school? And I'm like, yeah, did you? Because, like, honestly, there's no real reason why. Like, when I was growing up, it was pretty clear early on that I was going to rely on my brain and not physical activity, because which is probably like me doing any sort of construction or physical labor would take a really long time. Because when you got lousy balance, you shouldn't be climbing up and down ladders or anything like that, is what I'm saying. So I think when you have a physical disability, it becomes fairly obvious that, okay, the physical side of things is not going to be too quick. I mean, growing up in Montreal, obviously my career choice would have been playing for the Montreal Canadiens, but I don't think that is obviously going to happen. Although the way last season went, I still feel like I might help, but that's a separate issue. Um, yeah, so I think it's like, to me, yes, I'm proud of my accomplishments, but yeah, there's no reason why I wouldn't. Like, I do a joke about how we don't do math with our feet. Like, sitting at a computer, working on my Excel spreadsheets is like my happy place, and there's not really a reason why I wouldn't be able to do that, right? I think people have this misconception that if you have a certain disability, um, it it affects everything. Like, it's a pet peeve of mine when I get medical evaluations, which is talking about wasting. Like, the medical evaluation, they have to fill in every box on the form. So they start checking uh, the mental capacity and, well, are you depressed? Are you this? Are you that? I'm like, okay, we're probably going in more detail than we need to. Could I just get this particular issue that I asked you about resolved? Like, over the pandemic, I had gotten a new wheelchair because my wheelchair was worn out. So the government program is called Assistive Device Program, ADP, and you have to be assessed by an OT. And I tried asking for a public OT, and I spoke to 4 different people just to establish that I'm on a wait list, and they have no time, and they go through this whole assessment, and at the end of the assessment, they're like, "It sounds like you need an assistive devices program." An assistive devices program assessment. And I'm like, yes, that would be why I called up and said, could I have an assistive devices program assessment? So I feel like we probably, and the reason why I'm saying that's relevant for our conversation is we talk about not having money to increase disability, or DSP, or to, like, the money that people with disabilities have to live on, or we say we don't have money for accessible transportation. We have money, we just spend money really stupidly. um, and there's a lot of ways that we could be using it a lot more efficiently.
Do you think that the upcoming municipal election will help uh, us disability community uh uh be able to like openly tell our city councilors about accessibility issues that we see left, right, and center?
I hope so. I hope so. And every election, I have hope. Because so to go back in 2008, it kind of overlapped. There was a federal election here in Canada, and the U.S. had their election, and it was kind of around the same time. And I remember being very im impressed in the US and disappointed in Canada, because in the US, on both the Democratic and Republican side, there was a section for people with disabilities on what they were proposing to do. And I mean, obviously, different policies impact people with disabilities the same as everyone else. Like, obviously, healthcare is obviously something that impacts everybody, infrastructure. Like there are topics, obviously the topics that affect, for lack of a better word, the let's call it the non-disabled community. Obviously, those issues also affect people with disabilities, but there are other issues that I feel like we don't talk about enough. And what I've been trying to tell people is, we need allies. Like, it's not enough just for people with disabilities to be asking these questions of politicians. The non-disabled community also needs to be, um, vocal in asking the questions. Like, what I hope comes out of this whole story about the me being left for 7 hours, which, by the way, this isn't an isolated incident, because there was a guy, there's a person the next night who also got left, and there was someone 2 weeks ago. Like, this is not an isolated incident. So I I hope that people will consider this as one of the questions in evaluating their choices. Like, I hope our media, like when there's a mayoral debate, let's have a question. Ask the question: what are you going to do to increase the number of accessible taxis?
Do
I'd be interested in hearing that from the mayoral candidates.
do
Um,
do
so
you feel that getting your story out there through through the media is a way to advocate for others who
I
will experience that issue?
I do, and that's why I was motivated for it. Like, I did it not for people to say, "Oh, poor Michael." I did it so that we can fix it. Because, like, honestly, so, the to break down the 7 hours. So the first, my initial plan had been that I was going to travel home by adapted taxi. Because fortunately, I'm in a position where I can afford to pay for a taxi. So I said, okay, I'm going to, just because the problem with Paris Transpo is having to book in advance. And obviously, when trains can get delayed, I'm like, you know what? I don't want to have to deal with the hassle. When I arrive, I'm going to call and get a taxi. Um, so I called Capital Taxi. When I arrived at the train station, the dispatch told me it's going to be 1 hour, up to an hour. And I said, okay, fine, whatever. They're busy. Okay, I'll sit and wait. So I was waiting at the train station. After an hour, I tried to call. And what I noticed was that usually there's a recording that says, you have a booking for this and this address. Do you want to cancel? Like, there's an automated message that you can cancel your pickup. I didn't get that. So I asked the dispatch, is it here? Because I'm like, it used to be, because when I used to take taxis pre-COVID, it used to be up to 30 minutes. And it would be very rare that it would take the full 30 minutes, because usually, like at the time, what would happen is, after, let's say I call Capital Taxi, after 15 minutes, they would put it out to all taxi companies. And if another taxi company had a car available, they would come get me, because obviously there's a limit of how many accessible taxis there are in any given fleet. So I asked the dispatcher, and this was at 11:30 at night. Is there was a car dispatched? Because I didn't get that recording. He goes, yeah, I can see it here. It's been dispatched. You have to be patient. It's at least an hour, not up to an hour. And I'm like, okay, well, how long am I supposed to wait? So I waited a little longer, and then I gave up waiting because I wanted to get the last bus that I needed home. And when I called to cancel the taxi, I was told that there was no taxi ever dispatched. So I basically wasted 2 hours waiting for a cab that was never going to come. So that was the first failure. The second issue was that when I did get to the bus stop, the bus was rerouted to because of Blues Fest, the music festival going on here in Ottawa. So then I it was in it, except either myself or the five people that was waiting there obviously signed it, saw that. Um, and so then I went back downtown to our hotel that I know, figuring I'll at least have a place to stay inside and wait for a taxi to pick me up. But that didn't come till 5:30 in the morning because there were no accessible taxis. And I kind of feel like at the very least, could we have at least one accessible taxi on duty at all times? I feel like that would be a good goal to have. Um, I because I mean the fact that there's no one able to pick me up is just mind-boggling to me. And the kicker is that so I actually drive an adapted van. But I have, as part of the disability, I had issues with my hip, and I'm now on the list for hip replacement surgery, and I'm now on month 6 of the 3-month waiting list for a cortisone shot to relieve the pain. And I'm hoping once I have the cortisone shot, I'll at least be able to drive. Because the irony of all this is if we had the proper health care that I could have gotten the cortisone shot, I probably would have left my car in the parking lot at the train station and basically been home in 20 minutes. So that was the added kicker that you kind of get it's sort of multiple failures of a system, and it just becomes frustrating, as I'm sure Brent you could understand and relate to. Like, so want to have more income, they should get a job. I'm trying to work. All I'm asking for is being able to travel in my city for under 7 hours. I don't think I'm being all that demanding. Um, yeah, so there's kind of multiple issues that we end up facing, and it's amazing. What I found interesting was how unaware people are. And to go back to your point, Brent, about um, the municipal election, I actually had a city council say that he was gobsmacked by the story, and I'm like, okay, but I'm not the first person to be loved. So if you're gobsmacked, that's good because you should be gobsmacked. But and I've had a couple of counselors say they will ask questions, and I'm like, okay, but what questions are you going to ask, and what are we doing to resolve it? Like it's great to say you're sorry this happened, but what are we going to do to make it better, right? Because I'll be honest. I'm kind of over the fact. Okay, I stayed 7 hours in a train station. It sucked. I came home. I caught up on sleep. But now the question is, what do we do to do better in the future? That's
Do
where
you
I'm
do
interested.
you feel that getting your story out to the media, to the local media, will help
Uh,
the situation?
I hope so. I hope so because I think an unfortunate reality is that sometimes the expression "the greasy wheel gets the oil," or the squeaky wheel guess the grease. That's the expression. But I think every time there's a situation like this, we need to say our story. Every time there's a problem, people have to speak up. And I know it seems like, is anybody listening? And I'll be honest, it's times I feel like I'm screaming into the universe. And I know, and if there's a positive out of this whole thing, is I kind of got tired of talking about it and had stopped and kind of quieting down on advocating. And this kind of reignited my fire. So I do hope that me sharing my story, other people sharing their stories, um, covers it. And I hope it does become like, I hope it's not a story that the media covers for a week because this happened, or 2 weeks because this happened, that they stay on the story. And like I said, I hope that over the election campaign, we have conversations about it. Like I know, so there was one counselor that mentioned in a CTV news story that they were looking at a report to come out in spring 2023 about what to do to get more accessible taxis in Ottawa. Um, and I mean, it's great that they're doing the report. I would love that it would be a little quicker because if they say they're going to have a report in spring 2023, I suspect that then it's going to be a question of putting it in the budget, which means it won't be till 2024. Um, and then there'll be delays. And it'll be 2025. So I'm like, okay, can we try? And I totally get that there's been COVID and we had to deal with COVID and that costs money and all this stuff. But and I know COVID has impacted our healthcare system, and I feel for the people in our healthcare system. But at a point, it's not like our healthcare system was working smashingly well before COVID. So there needs to be, like, we need to rethink how we deliver services for people who need it. Because I think we spend a far too much money on the bureaucracy behind the scenes and not enough on the front end service. Like I've been to the hospital a couple of times now, and I keep on getting surveys on how my experience was. And I'm like, okay, instead of administering a survey, and everybody's saying how bad it is. Like if you look at the healthcare system, I think it's an obvious question. Instead of putting money into a survey on how your experience was, how about putting it into actually delivering the services so it is a better experience? Um, that's just my 2 cents. That I um, it like right now, instead of having someone who can tell me how to fill in the little questionnaire at the hospital, I'd be far more interested in someone who can give me a focus point. Um, but and honestly, I like I in talking to people, I I hear other stories. Like this is not a complaint that's unique to me. And I think in some ways, some people have it worse. And that, like I said, I'm lucky in that I can have the option to be able to call a taxi. Um, I'd like the wait times a little bit lower to get a taxi, but that's another story. But I do have the option that if I want to go out, like let's say somebody called me up and said, "Hey, Mike, do you want to go out tonight for a coffee?" I have some options that I can eventually, hopefully, get there to go for coffee. Maybe not as easily as someone without a disability, but I do have options. Whereas someone who relies on Transpo, they don't really do last minute bookings, right? So they have to plan a day in advance. So they kind of miss out, which I know has been a complaint of some people who are relying on on Paratranspo. So I hope, and like I said, I hope it does. I hope this story does encourage conversation over the course, and I certainly plan to be asking those questions to candidates. And I would encourage your listeners that are in Ottawa and in other cities, because this isn't a unique situation in Ottawa. This is in all cities. Um, Ask your local officials, what are you going to do? Like, it's nice to say we have an accessible, an act for an accessibility act for Canadians with disabilities, and we have the AODA, the Act for Ontario Accessibility. I forget what the abbreviation is. The AODA here in Ontario. Um, so there are laws saying that we need to be treated as equals. Um, but I think there needs to be more thought put into how do we actually put this into action, right? To actually impact the day to day life of people with disabilities.
I thought they passed laws and stuff that requires. I mean, in America they do. I mean, like for restaurants and buses and different things. I thought there were laws required, but the actual like transportation, like even though if the bus was accessibility, I think the everyday like the shutter and the taxi and all that. I would assume that they would require that.
The bus, I believe, is so the AODA, the Accessible Ontarians with Disability Act. I believe they had till 2025 to implement it. So and I think that's why there's a discussion now in Ottawa. How do we make Ontario, like, I find a lot of the laws are you must develop a plan of how you're going to get there, and that's great, and I get that we can't all do it at once, but when you're someone just trying to live your day-to-day life, um saying, well, by 2025 you'll be able to, I'm like, okay, well, there's something to look forward to. It, in 2025, it won't take me 7 hours to get home from the train station. I'm super excited about that. But I mean, I know there are exemptions for small businesses. So, like, under a certain number, I think it's under 20 employees, you're exempt, and I get that. But like I was laughing because I had gone to a show at a bar. It happened to be a gay bar, and it was a comedy show. And I arrived, and the server was explaining to me that there was an elevator, but the door to get to the elevator was too small for the wheelchair. And I'm like, okay, well, a key aspect of an elevator is that people who need the elevator can actually get to it. That's kind of an important feature. Um, and like the guy was saying to me that, well, in the 1800s, they weren't building buildings for people in wheelchairs, which is a valid point. But my counter argument was that there were also no gay bars. So I'm like, at least one of us is making progress. Well done. And this isn't to say that there shouldn't be gay bars. Absolutely, there should be. But um, and I know everyone talks about it's a woke society and all this stuff. And honestly, I'm all for being a jerk and a bigot. So I don't know that it's woke, but like I like to say, I find when it comes to people with disabilities, we're still a little sleepy, to use the woke analogy. Um, and I'll give you guys an example. In comedy, we talk about safe spaces and not to offend people of different groups. And I'll be honest, I'm on board with that. Like, I don't like, my goal is not to. I don't believe in being shocking or trying to pick on any individual group. Um, but like the word we use is punch up, not punch down. But so we talk about safe space and or homophobic joke or whatever it may be. But I've actually posted saying what places are accessible, and I get told, if you want to come, well, why don't you bring a ramp? Okay, well, a um, if I could carry around my own ramp, I probably wouldn't need the wheelchair. And B, not everyone who's in a wheelchair has a person with them all the time who can carry the ramp for them. And C, different ramps, like different buildings have different setups. So we need different ramps. Would it not make more sense for the venue to actually get a ramp and be accessible? And then it's not just for me, it's for anybody who wants to attend their, wants to come to their location at any time. They have a ramp handy. Like, to me, it should be on the premise, not on the people, not on the person with the disability to say it. To have to like, it shouldn't be, the onus shouldn't be on the person with the disability to fit into the inaccessible world. The inaccessible world should be trying to, and I hate to use the word accommodate, but I can't come up with a better one. We should be looking, how can we as a society make it fit for the people with the disability. Because the thing that drives me nuts is when places talk about having events that are open to everyone, but they're in an inaccessible location. And I get it. There's small businesses. It's hard to be able, like, it can be expensive to put in an elevator, and it's not feasible. But in my mind, if you're saying we're open to everyone, but your places are not accessible, then, like, what are you saying? Someone with a disability is not a person, or it's not, like, that's kind of the message you're giving off, because you're not accessible to everyone. If you, if like, if a person in a wheelchair can't get into your location, and ideally be able to use the washroom, because that's a big issue in Ottawa, is there's places you can get in on the to the place, but then the washrooms are down a flight of stairs. Um, then I'm sorry, you're not open to everyone, right?
And
Uh,
do you find that in some places that if the washroom, if there's no elevator, then you can't get down to
uh,
it if the washroom is in the lower floor?
yeah, so I actually was thinking to come out with a guidebook, places to pee in in Ottawa, um, because so, like, the market particularly, again, because and I don't mean to pick on the market, but just the market is an older area of Ottawa, um, but like, there's shows that I'd go to, would go do, that either, so previously, I was able to do a little bit of stairs. So, like, if it was one step to get in, I would leave the wheelchair outside and be able to walk in. Unfortunately, I can't do that anymore. And then part of me feels like, should I have to? Because a place with one step should have a ramp. Like, if the only issue to get into your place is one step, then that's just being lazy. Because honestly, there's, how expensive is it to get a small ramp for one step? Um, like that, that kind of annoys me. Um, and again, like, I feel like there's people. So we had a show here that, um, people were starting to ask, well, would we be able to get a ramp, and would you be able to keep it at the restaurant? And the organizers were said, well, we only organize the show. We don't work. It's not up to us. We can't control what the restaurant does. And I'm like, okay, but if we're talking about allies, could you at least have the conversation with, um, the restaurant about getting a ramp? And what's funny is, I don't know if they've resumed operations, but I know pre-COVID, there's a group here in Ottawa called Stopgap, where they would put, like, for a single step, they would go around the city giving ramps out, and it was for a donation. So basically, you could donate what you want, and they would give a ramp for that single step. So it would not cost a whole lot. Um, and I think it's up to, um, and that's where I think and I don't mean to repeat myself, but I think that's where we need allies. It's not enough just for the person in the wheelchair to um, to say we need ramps. It's up for non-disabled people to say, well, you know what, this is something that I believe is important. And I was quite happy. I was when I was going to Toronto, I was looking up a restaurant, and I saw on their Facebook page. It was a new restaurant that had opened, and I was looking at their Facebook page to see if they're accessible. And there was a person who they said they don't have a disability, but they choose to only support places that are accessible, and therefore they would not be going to this establishment. And I'm like, maybe that's what needs to start happening for places to start considering to. And again, I get if it's a place that there's a whole flight of stairs, I get it. It's expensive, but like a single step to just put a ramp for someone to get in, and then maybe you know what you work out, like get creative. Like the down the street that people who need the washroom can go use the washroom, their washroom, because their washroom is accessible. Um, or like if the next door has an accessible washroom, like maybe share the cost of an accessible washroom between two restaurants and you both can use it. Like I don't know, get a little creative with the solutions, right? Um, so yeah, I think and I hope, like, I know I got a lot of people saying it was ridiculous that I had to wait 7 hours, and I hope these same people consider it. Like when they do events, do it in an accessible location. Make your events accessible. Like I have a comic friend I met in Toronto. Decided that she was committing that any show she produces would be access accessible to everyone, which means uh, um, people of the LGBTQ community would feel comfortable coming. So in terms of like, there wouldn't be comics that would be considered transphobic or homophobic in their material, and people with wheelchairs would be able to get in and actually use the washroom. Like I've had places here in Ottawa that I go, and I think the servers think I'm crazy because I compliment their bathrooms um, for the accessibility. But these are things that, as people with disabilities, we have to consider. Because if you're going to go out and be at a restaurant for 2 hours, enjoying dinner and drinks with friends, you need to think about, am I going to be able to use the washroom? Those are things we need to think about, right?
Yeah, I
Yes,
was,
those.
and again, like I'm still kind of baffled that in 2022 that is not fully accessible. I mean, I have a friend that she designs restaurants, and this was back like 20 years ago. She was like, "This is my thing now. I have to make sure when I design these restaurants that they have to be accessible." And that was 20 years ago. So now I'm sure I just assume every restaurant, every place you go to, that they I thought that by law they would have to, but maybe
I
it's different in Canada.
I feel like the U.S. is a little. So this was my, and I have no scientific evidence of this, but this was just my theory. I feel like the states is further ahead because, well, you had the Americans with Disabilities Act way before we had ours. So that's the first step. Whereas our legislation is just starting to have these conversations, and I feel like that maybe the Vietnam War had something to do with it because you had more uh, veterans that needed the accessibility. Um, so you guys were a little bit more, um, and I hate to say the war was a positive thing, but I think just the necessity of having more people with disabilities um, from Vietnam that led to um, being further ahead in terms of legislation with, and I'm glad you said that about restaurants, because in my mind, like what I would do is, which I don't think is currently the law, in my mind, if you want to do renovations, part of your submission for permits is that you have to explain how you're going to make it accessible. And the only exception should be a prohibitive cost to make it accessible. Because I'm not an expert on the AOD, on the Americans with Disabilities Act, but I believe, like, I know one of the things which I thought was a great idea was like for event space, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because I only looked this up quickly, was that for the Americans with Disabilities Act says that you need to have event accessible seating in all categories of tickets. And if there's a category of ticket, like let's say it's not feasible to you for balcony seats to be accessible, then you would have to offer the accessible seating at the price of the balcony seats, because you can't charge someone with a disability more to get seating if you're not giving them the option of, and it, like honestly, I've, like, to me, I should have the option when I go to an event. Do I want to pay for the most expensive seats and the best seats in the house, and sit there? I should still have that option, even though I'm in a wheelchair. And then there should also be less expensive seats if I choose to do that. Um, what I found interesting, going back to the question of taxi, it's only recently that it became a law that taxi companies were not allowed to charge more for a person with a disability in order to recoup the costs of the equipment. So, like, I had once gone to Toronto, took a taxi to my hotel, and it was literally 2 blocks. But I had my luggage, so it was hard for me to get to my hotel. So I took a taxi, and I could literally see the hotel from the train station. I get to the hotel. I get told it's $40. So $40 to go about 2 blocks. Another time in Winnipeg, I actually found out Winnipeg was another city where they had that practice that cab companies would up the price for accessible taxis because they need to recoup the cost of the equipment. And I get the fact that it's expensive for them to have it, but it's not really fair to put that burden on the person with a disability. So it actually now is elite a violation of the Ontario Act. Taxi cab companies are not allowed to charge a premium for people with disabilities, which makes sense. But then we're back to that whole question about, okay, well, how do we pay for it? And that's the $23,000 question, because it costs $23,000 a car. And I think the reality is government does have a role to play in subsidizing these things. So, for example, gas tax. Gas tax is supposed to go to pay for public transportation. So, a portion of that budget, like I know there's people who have said, and I agree with them, if 20% of the population is has disabilities, then 20% of our transportation budget should go towards accessible options, right? A proportionate, like what percentage of the ridership has disabilities, and then that percentage should go to offering accessible options. And I don't think we're quite there yet, but I think we're getting there. And the problem is that the legislation. So I think the Accessible Canada Act, people have till 2030 to implement it. So 2030 is going to be a big year for me. 2030 is going to be the year I can actually get around Canada uh, fully without it taking 7 hours to get home. So it's something to look forward to, but I'm hoping we can go a little quicker with that.
It's
Doesn't it sound so far away, 2030 though? I mean, like I thought it'd be happening now.
It does, and that's why like when I hear politicians say, "Well, we're looking into a study, and in 2023 we're going to get the study," and I'm like, okay, but what do people like myself and Brent and the other Canadians living with disabilities? What do we do until then, right? That's the question, right? Um, it and like sometimes I'm like, okay, really, like honestly, it boggles my mind when I travel. I mean, uh, I have to say via because I took the train with Via Vale, and I have to say they were excellent when it came to the wheelchair. But airlines, like the number of times, uh, like it's got to the point that when I fly, I go with the theory they're gonna tell me that the wheelchair fell out mid-flight and is in a million pieces. Because then that way, whatever they do tell me is gonna be better than that. So, like, if you set the bar low enough, it's easy for them to pass. But it does kind of boggle my mind that, like, in the 21st century, we haven't mastered traveling with a wheelchair. Like, it shouldn't be like the reason I got a BlackBerry, my first BlackBerry, I'm like, was because I traveled for the first time with my wheelchair. And I'm like, I could be doing email while I'm waiting at the counter because it seems like, and it it amazes me, and I think this is where bureaucracy comes in, because the bigger the airline, the seemingly more challenging it is to travel with a wheelchair. And you would think it would be the opposite, that smaller airlines would have a harder time with it. But like I've taken my wheelchair to Dominican Republic and Cuba. So I've been to Dominican Republic and Cayo, Cuba. And admittedly, when I go, I'm traveling as a tourist. So obviously, my experience is the tourist experience, which I'm sure if I was living in these countries, it would not be quite as easy to get around. But when you go to the all-inclusive resort, like I arranged a car to travel, and I'm like, how is it that I can go to a developing country um, where I don't necessarily speak the language. Like I have minimal Spanish, and they managed to handle my wheelchair better than Air Canada. Like that's not. Like I went. Like I do a joke about how in Cuba, the accessible taxi was four Cuban guys lifting my wheelchair onto the bus, and then getting me a regular taxi to take me to the resort. But I'm like, hey, they still managed to do it better than Air Canada. So kudos to them. So I'm like, okay, I don't know. I feel like and sometimes I think, okay, we're making progress, and then something like this experience last weekend happens, and I'm like, are we though? Because um, it. I mean, the reality is, in the last month, there was one time I waited 2.5 hours for an accessible taxi, which I had forgot. It didn't seem that long because I was sitting talking to friends, so it wasn't quite as bad. Like the time obviously passes quicker if you're sitting talking to people than if you're sitting by yourself. Um, but that seems like like there's got to be a solution to this, and I think the answer is that when politicians pass laws, aside from setting up the bureaucracy to administer the law, there also has to be dollars for actually implementing the law because it's and there's also part of me that feels like, is there not an opportunity for economies of scale? So like for example, in Canada we have an association of municipalities, and I know you see on Twitter mayors snapping selfies with each other, um, talking with their friends. And I would like to believe they're also talking about common issues they're facing. Could we not get uh, an agreement amongst municipalities? So, for example, I'm part of Transpo here in Ottawa, and I do. Uh, so, if I go to another city like Toronto, I used to have guest access to their wheel strand, so I could schedule their adapted transportation to pick me up and take me places. And the wheel strands, I lost access because I wasn't using it regularly enough. And I'm like, okay, well, by definition, guest access, you're visiting a city. Like, does it make sense? So I was going to Barrie, um, and I looked into Barrie's adapted transportation, and like I had to get a form filled in from OC Transpo to go to Barrie for them to review. And I'm like, okay, all this paperwork, we're paying people to do that. Could we not save that money by having, okay, Michael's disability is permanent, so Michael can use any of the cities in Canada, and then the cities figure it out. Like I feel like with computers, it should be fairly easy for me to say, I'm a member. Here's my membership number, and then look up. Yes, you are part of OC Transpo. I don't know. Like I don't know, Brent, if you have your experience in going to different cities in Canada, like what you would think of that kind of idea about having that kind of reciprocity.
I think that it should be that if we have disability access in one city, it should be across cities. And and I and I'd like to thank you for coming to my show. But first, before I close the space,
Oh.
can you can you tell our listeners how to get a hold of you in case they want to hear more about your story or help you to start a coalition or a uh, a group of people to help with this accessible issue?
Absolutely. So the easiest way to find me is Ability. So ILLUM and abilities, the word ability, which is also my Twitter handle. So I imagine they're probably going to see that on the space, I think, if they click on me. But yeah, by all means, uh, reach out because I'm always happy to talk with people and collaborate on projects because I think the stories that I keep on hearing, clearly there's more work to do. And obviously, the more people who amplify the voice, the better it's going to be, right? So, and I thank you for having me on.
Yeah, Michael, we didn't get a chance to talk about your company, Breakaway Experiences. That's what I wanted to know more about too. But we'll have to get you to come back
Okay,
so we
there
can
you
talk.
go.
Yeah,
We'll do another thing on breakaway experiences. But I
because
appreciate you having me on.
I believe that people in the 2022 now and I always say that people will pay for an experience before they would, back in the 80s when I was growing up, 80s and 90s, we like, the more you have, the more brand you got, the more bags, the more shoes, the more you got is better, right? But now in 2022, it's more about the experience, like that you can I would buy an experience for someone as a gift than before I'd go out and buy them, an expensive handbag. So
Absolutely, and that's the trend we're seeing because at the end of the day, it's all about the memories you make together doing stuff, right? And like that quality. I think if anything, COVID reinforced that, right? Because I like honestly, I didn't miss the stuff, right? I miss going out, seeing that quality time with people and doing stuff, right? So yeah, totally.
a great space, and we have people popping in and out. But thank you, Davey, for being here. But Brent, great space. We'll be back next week, next Monday, same time, same place.
Thanks for co-hosting, Tanya, and I would love to have you back at some point, Michael, in the future to talk about breakaway experiences.
Absolutely. Let me know. I'll be glad to do it.
And Disability Hour will be back next Monday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time with another amazing guest, Christine.
Yeah, that's gonna be a lot of fun. That'd be awesome. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Michael. It's great connecting with you. I learned so much. And again, 7 hours. I was gonna ask you how was your blood sugar. I would be like punching the wall if I had to wait for something for 7 hours, especially if it took me 5 hours to get there.
They had a little snack station at the hotel, so I at least had. So at a point, I broke down and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna get a chocolate bar because I need something. But I slept well when I came home on the bright side. But I better let you guys sign off. Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to talking with you guys again
Thank you
soon.
for thank you for co-hosting, Tanya.
My pleasure. Thank you, Michael. And bye, Brent. What a great space. Thank you.